The car stopped in the middle of Manhattan traffic, and no one understood why. Margaret Voss was 52 years old, CEO of the largest investment group in the Western Hemisphere, and she didn't stop the car for anything. Not for funerals. Not for herself. But that Tuesday in November, with rain hitting the windshield and the board meeting starting from that hour forward, she hit the brakes so suddenly that the driver lurched forward and nearly slammed his face into the steering wheel. "Mrs. Voss?" he asked, turning with that expression of controlled fright her employees learned quickly. She didn't answer. Outside, on the soaked sidewalk of 46th Street, a woman was sitting on the ground with her back against a metal crate. Black, hair tied with a worn elastic, a brown coat 2 sizes too large, eyes closed like someone sleeping or giving up. Around her, the entire city passed without looking. But Margaret couldn't take her eyes off just one thing, the necklace. Thin, golden, with a small pendant in the shape of a nautical compass. She had commissioned that necklace by hand, at a jeweler in Florence, 12 years earlier. A birthday gift for her son. She had chosen the compass because he loved sailing. Because he said one day he was going to sail around the world and always wanted to know where he was. There was only one in the world. She knew that with the same certainty she knew her own name. Her son's name was Theo. And Theo died 4 years ago. Or so they told her. Margaret got out of the car before the driver had time to open the door. The rain soaked her coat in seconds, but she walked down the sidewalk without caring, her heels clicking on the wet stones, her eyes fixed on that golden pendant swaying on the woman's neck with each breath. She got close. She crouched down. And stayed there looking for a moment that seemed to last much longer than it should. The woman opened her eyes. They were tired eyes. Not frightened, not angry. Just tired. With that quiet depth of someone who has lived through things that don't ask permission before happening. "Can you tell me where you got that necklace?" Margaret asked, and her own voice sounded strange to her. Too quiet. Too controlled. The woman looked at her for a long second. "Why do you want to know?" Margaret opened her mouth. Closed it. No answer she knew would work for that moment. The woman's name was Adiz. 38 years old, according to herself, though she looked older. She had arrived in New York from Atlanta 2 years earlier, after a series of things she described only as the life collapsing in a way you can't explain standing on a sidewalk. She had no family in the city, no fixed address, nothing tying her to the visible world. And she had worn that necklace since she woke up in a hospital not knowing where she was, not knowing who had left it hanging in her hand inside a plastic bag with her belongings. The hospital. Atlanta. 2 years ago. Margaret felt the ground slipping beneath her feet, but not from fear. From something larger. Something she didn't know how to name yet, but that weighed like a truth about to change everything she thought she knew about the day her son disappeared. Because Theo didn't die in a car accident. Theo vanished. The car was found at the bottom of a ravine near Asheville, North Carolina. The body never appeared. The police closed the case in 8 months with the conclusion of probably swept away by the current. Margaret paid 3 private investigation firms. Nobody found anything. She spent 2 years trying. Then stopped trying, not because she believed it, but because continuing to search was consuming what was left of her. And now a homeless woman in New York was wearing the compass from Florence. Margaret took off her soaked coat and placed it over Adiz's shoulders without asking permission. Then she stayed there, crouching, not knowing what to do for the first time in decades. "Do you have anywhere to sleep tonight?" she asked. Adiz took her time to answer. "No." Margaret stood up, looked at the driver standing 3 meters away with that expression of a man who had learned not to ask anything, and said only, "Open the car." If you're enjoying this story, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what you think so far. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. You'll want to see what comes next. The guest bedroom in Margaret Voss's penthouse had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. Adiz stood in the entrance for almost a minute, looking at all of it without saying anything. It wasn't admiration. It was the look of someone who needs to first understand if a place is safe before truly entering. Margaret understood without needing it explained. "You don't have to stay if you don't want to," she said, and said it in a way that didn't sound like rich generosity. It sounded like respect. "But there's food, there's a shower, and no one will come in without knocking." Adiz entered. That night, while the city below kept spinning at its indifferent pace, the 2 women sat at a dining table too large for 2 people and stayed in silence for a time that could have been uncomfortable, but wasn't. There was something between them that still had no name, but that took up space. It was Adiz who spoke first. She told how she woke up in a hospital in Atlanta on a Sunday in March 2 years ago. No documents. No phone. No memory of how she had gotten there. The doctor said she had been brought in unconscious by a man who left no name, and that she showed signs of severe cranial trauma. She was hospitalized for 3 weeks. When she was discharged, the hospital gave her a plastic bag with the only things she had: one sock, a key that didn't open anything she found, and the necklace. Margaret listened to every word without interrupting. "Did you try to find out who took you to the hospital?" she asked when Adiz finished. "I tried. But when I went back to ask, the receptionist who had been on duty that night no longer worked there, and the entry record from that Sunday had disappeared from the system." Silence. Margaret stood up, went to the window, stared at the lights below. Theo disappeared on a Friday in March 2 years ago. The difference was 48 hours. She didn't say that out loud yet, but she stored it. The next day, Margaret cancelled all meetings. Her assistant, a 30-year-old woman named Petra who had learned that unnecessary questions had a high cost, received a list of tasks that included locating the hospital in Atlanta, obtaining entry records from March 2 years ago, and discreetly hiring an investigator she had used before. No explanations. Just instructions. Meanwhile, Margaret asked Adiz to stay a few more days. Not as a favor. As a necessity. The necklace needed to be explained. And there was something else. Something Margaret hadn't told anyone because she didn't know how to put into words without seeming like she'd lost her mind. The previous night, while Adiz slept, she had stayed awake looking at an old photo of Theo. And she noticed something in the line of Adiz's face, in the shape of her eyes, in the way she tilted her head when thinking, that reminded her of someone. Not Theo, but someone she had known for a long time. She couldn't identify who. Yet. It was on the 3rd day that the first problem appeared. His name was Conrad Voss. Margaret's brother-in-law. Younger brother of her deceased husband, executive board member of the group, and the only man in the world who looked at her as if she were a temporary obstacle rather than the person who had built everything. Conrad was 56, well-cut silver hair, the smile of someone who practices smiling in front of a mirror. He was the type of man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. His power worked in silence, in hallway conversations, in favors that created debts nobody signed but everyone owed. He appeared in Margaret's office one afternoon without warning. "I heard you brought someone to live in the penthouse," he said, sitting in the chair across from her desk without being invited. "You heard wrong," Margaret replied without looking up from the documents. "She's staying as a guest." "That's different." "Who is she?" "Someone who needs help." Conrad was silent for a moment, then smiled that way. "Margaret, you know that everything you do reflects on the company, on our reputation. Especially now, with the merger underway. This wouldn't be the moment for sentimental gestures." She looked up for the first time. "Conrad, when I need your opinion on what I do in my own home, I'll ask." He stood up unhurriedly, buttoned his jacket, went to the door, paused with his hand on the knob. "I just want you to be well," he said. "Theo's death affected you in ways that sometimes I think even you don't realize." He left before she could answer. Margaret sat looking at the closed door, and thought about something she had noticed but not yet fully processed. Conrad knew Theo had disappeared on a road near Asheville, but he had never asked where the car was found. Never. In 4 years, not once. As if he already knew. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She stayed in the living room at 3 in the morning with a cup of coffee that cooled without being drunk, a notepad on the table, and 4 years of unanswered questions beginning to organize themselves differently. Not as pain. As architecture. She had built an empire by learning to transform chaos into structure, and now she was doing the same thing with the hardest story of her life. She wrote 3 columns. What she knew. What she suspected. What she needed to prove. The middle column was the longest. The next morning, Adiz came downstairs to the kitchen and found Margaret still awake, hair loose for the first time since they had met, eyes with that strange clarity that comes after an entire sleepless night spent thinking without stopping. "I need you to tell me everything," Margaret said. "Not as an order. As a request. Before Atlanta. What do you remember?" Adiz sat down. Poured coffee. Stayed silent for a moment. That wasn't hesitation, it was choice. When she spoke, it was slowly. She remembered fragments. A small town. A house with a wooden porch. A man whose face she couldn't see but whose voice she recognized as someone who treated her well. An argument that wasn't with her but happened nearby. And then darkness. Not the gradual kind that comes with sleep. The abrupt kind that comes with violence. Margaret listened to each fragment as if it were a piece she was storing to assemble later. "That man whose face you can't see," she said carefully. His voice. Was he young? Adiz closed her eyes for a second. "Yes," she said. "Young. And he called me something. A nickname. But I can't remember which one." Margaret wrote that in the middle column. That same day, the investigator Petra had hired sent the first report. His name was Darian Osei, a former federal officer, known for being discreet and for not asking questions the client hadn't asked first. The report was short, but what was in it was enough to change the temperature of the room. Adiz's entry record at the Atlanta hospital had been deleted from the system. Not corrupted. Not lost. Deliberately deleted, by someone with administrative access to the hospital system, on a specific date, 2 weeks after her admission. And the man who had made that access used credentials of an employee who had resigned the next day. An employee who, according to the report, had received a considerable bank transfer 3 days before deleting the file. The transfer came from an overseas account. An account that, after 2 layers of intermediary companies, linked to a private investment fund registered in the Cayman Islands. Darian hadn't yet been able to identify the fund's owner. But Margaret already had a suspicion. She went to the personal archive she kept at home, not at the office, a metal box that sat at the back of the closet and that she hadn't opened in 2 years because opening it hurt too much. Inside were documents from the investigation process of Theo's death. Police reports. Expert assessments. Correspondence with the private detectives. And at the bottom, something she had kept without knowing exactly why. A list of calls made from Theo's phone in the last 48 hours before his disappearance. She had already analyzed that list 4 years ago. At the time, no number seemed relevant. Now she looked again, with different eyes. And found something that had gone unnoticed. 3 calls to a number she didn't recognize, each lasting less than a minute. All on the same day. The number was deactivated and had never been identified. But the area code was from Atlanta. Margaret closed the box, went to the window, and stood looking at the park for a long time. Theo had called Atlanta before disappearing. She went back to the table, opened the computer, and sent a message to Darian with a number. She needed to know who it belonged to beforehand. Needed to know if there was any connection to the Cayman Islands Fund. And she needed one more thing, which she wrote last and with more care than the others. She needed a DNA test done in absolute silence. No record. No conventional laboratory. No paper that could be found by someone who knew where to look. Adiz didn't know this yet. Margaret spent the following afternoon acting normally. Meetings. Calls. Multimillion-dollar decisions made with the same coldness as always. Conrad appeared in 2 of them and she treated him exactly as she always had, with efficiency and calculated distance. She gave no signal. She changed no pattern. But that night, before sleeping, she wrote a sentence on the notepad and circled it 3 times. Who knew that Theo had found Adiz? Because someone knew. And that someone had spent time, money, and considerable risk to ensure the 2 would never meet. Which meant the encounter on the sidewalk of 46th Street wasn't just improbable. It was exactly what someone had spent years trying to prevent. The DNA result arrived on a Thursday morning. Darian delivered it personally, in an unmarked envelope, at 7 o'clock, before any employee arrived at the apartment. Margaret opened it alone in the kitchen, with the same coffee as always cooling beside her. She read it once. Read it again. Stood looking at the numbers and percentages with the expression of someone receiving a confirmation they already knew was coming, but that still weighs differently when it arrives on paper. Adiz was the biological daughter of Margaret's husband. Theo's half-sister. Same paternal line. 99.7% correspondence. Margaret folded the envelope, put it in her robe pocket, and went to wash the cup. She kept her hands under the water longer than necessary. She wasn't processing her husband's betrayal. That was too old to still cut deep. She was processing something else. She was understanding that Theo had discovered this before her. That he had found Adiz, had built some kind of connection with her, had tried to protect her. And that someone had destroyed all of it before either of them could tell the story. That someone had tried to erase Adiz from existence. And had tried to do the same to Theo. That same day, Darian sent the second report. The Atlanta number that Theo had called 3 times belonged to a disposable phone. Dead trail. But the investigator had found something else. A gas station camera 40 kilometers from Asheville that had recorded, on the night of Theo's disappearance, a car that wasn't Theo's stopping for 18 minutes on the shoulder of the same road where the accident would have occurred. The car was a black sedan. The license plate was partially covered by mud. Partially. Darian had managed to get the 3 visible digits, and had cross-referenced them with fleet records from companies in the region. The car belonged to an outsourced services company contracted by the Voss Group 6 years earlier. A company whose contract had been personally approved by a single executive board member. Conrad. Margaret read this and didn't feel anger. She felt something colder and more dangerous than anger. She felt clarity. She spent the next 48 hours building the case with Darian. Every document. Every bank transfer. Every thread linking Conrad to the erasure of Adiz, to the night on the road, to the Cayman Islands Fund. It wasn't a perfect case yet. There were gaps. But there was enough for what she was planning to do. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. Official agenda: approval of a merger with a European group that would double the company's value. Conrad had spent months building that merger. It was the biggest move of his career. The moment when, in his own words said in a meeting 3 weeks earlier, the Voss Group would finally enter a new era. Margaret didn't cancel the meeting. Didn't change the agenda. Didn't warn anyone. On Monday morning, Adiz was in the apartment when Margaret was getting ready to leave. The two had talked the previous night for hours. Margaret had told her everything. The DNA. Conrad. Theo. Everything. Adiz had listened without crying, which Margaret hadn't expected, but then understood. Adiz had spent 2 years surviving without knowing who she was. Crying needed solid ground. She was still building the ground. "You don't have to be there," Margaret said before leaving. "I know," Adiz replied. "But I want to." The boardroom was on the 43rd floor. 12 people around a glass table. Conrad sitting to Margaret's right, as always, with that smile of a man who believes the results are already decided. Margaret opened the meeting normally. Let the first 20 minutes follow the expected script. Financial updates. Projections. The relaxed atmosphere of people who think they know what's happening. Then she placed the envelope on the table. "Before voting on the merger, I need to present a governance matter." Conrad looked at the envelope. Something passed across his face. Fast, but Margaret saw it. She presented everything. Calmly. With precision. Each document in the right order, each connection explained without unnecessary drama. How the money had moved, the gas station camera, the outsourced company, the Atlanta hospital employee. And last, the DNA result. The silence in the room was the kind that precedes decisions with no way back. Conrad tried to speak. He started with denial, then recontextualization, then the most desperate version Margaret had anticipated, that he had done it to protect the company, to protect her husband's legacy, to avoid a scandal that would destroy everything her husband had built. It was at that moment the room door opened. Adiz walked in. And Conrad stopped talking mid-sentence. Not because she said anything. Because she didn't need to. She simply stood in the entrance of the room, with the golden necklace at her neck, looking at him with that quietness of someone who survived things he had planned to destroy her with, and had survived anyway. The board president asked for the floor. Then the legal director. Then the others. Conrad was removed from the room 40 minutes later with an escort and a list of charges that Darian and the legal department had already prepared. He left without looking back. Margaret stayed sitting at the head of the table after everyone left, alone for a moment, and for the first time in 4 years felt that the weight she had been carrying had changed in nature. It hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something she could, finally, sustain while standing. The weeks that followed weren't simple. Margaret had learned long ago that justice and simplicity rarely appear together, and that when a truth too large finally comes to light, the real work begins after. Not before. Conrad was formally charged with obstruction, record manipulation, and complicity in a crime against a person. The process would be long. His lawyers were good. But the evidence was better, and Darian had built a case that left no elegant way out. The merger was temporarily suspended, then resumed under new terms, without Conrad's influence in any clause. The company didn't collapse. It was never going to collapse. Margaret had built it to last, and the structures she builds don't fall because of a man who confused power with impunity. But it was Adiz who occupied Margaret's thoughts in those weeks. Not the company. Not the process. Adiz. Because the truth had arrived, and the truth was enormous, but a person's life doesn't rebuild itself with revelations. It rebuilds itself with days. With small choices made repeatedly in the right direction. And Adiz had 2 years of a hole in the middle of her own story that needed to be filled not with documents or inheritances, but with time and with space to be a person again. They talked every morning. Sometimes for hours. Sometimes in silence on the balcony, looking at the park, with coffee in hand. Margaret had discovered that Adiz had a background in architecture, interrupted before finishing, and that before everything fell apart she had been a person with projects and plans, and that specific energy of someone who believes the future will be larger than the present. "You can go back to being that person," Margaret said one of those mornings. "I don't know if I want to be her again," Adiz replied, looking at the horizon. "I think I want to be someone else. Someone who went through all of this and came out the other side." Margaret was silent. Then said, "That's better." The inheritance question was the most delicate. Legally, Adiz had a right to a part of the biological father's estate, Margaret's husband. The lawyers presented the options with the technical coldness lawyers used to speak about things that are, in reality, deeply human. Margaret listened to everything and then dismissed everyone from the room except Adiz. "What do you want?" she asked directly. Adiz took her time to answer. "I want to finish my education. I want a place that's mine. I want to stop looking over my shoulder every time someone approaches." Margaret nodded. "That I can guarantee without any lawyer needing to enter a courtroom." What she did was simpler and more permanent than any legal process. She created a fund in Adiz's name, independent of the Voss Group, untouchable by any future dispute, sufficient to cover the education, an apartment, and a few years of margin to breathe and choose. She did this not as reparation for something she had done, because she hadn't done anything. She did it as recognition that Adiz's life had been interrupted by people who used her family name to protect themselves, and that there was a responsibility that didn't need guilt to exist. There was also the matter of Theo. Darian kept investigating. The gas station camera had proven something had happened on that road. But Theo's body had never been found, and the absence of a body meant the absence of absolute certainty. Margaret had lived 4 years with that. Learned to carry it without resolving it. But now there was a difference. There was the possibility, thin as paper but real, that Theo had survived. That Conrad had planned the disappearance without planning the death. That somewhere there was an answer she still didn't have. She decided to keep looking. Not with desperation. With quiet determination. On an afternoon in December, 3 months after the sidewalk of 46th Street, Margaret and Adiz went together to a jewelry shop downtown. Not the one in Florence. A small, discreet one, on a street Margaret had never entered before. Adiz chose a second necklace, simple, different from the compass, something that was only hers. And Margaret watched while she tried it on, with that expression people make when they are deliberately storing a moment in memory. Because she had learned, finally, to pay attention to things before they disappeared. What Margaret Voss understood in those months didn't fit in an executive report or in a board decision. It fit in those mornings on the balcony. It fit in the face of a woman rebuilding her own life from scratch with a dignity that no fortune buys. It fit in the understanding that the people the world decides to make invisible keep existing anyway, keep carrying necklaces and memories and fragments of stories no one wanted to hear, and that sometimes all it takes is for one person to stop the car for a truth that had been buried to finally breathe again. She had stopped the car for a necklace. But what she found was far greater than anything she had been looking for. If this story moved you in some way, leave a comment telling us what you thought and which city or country you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Stories like this need to be told, and it's your presence here that makes it possible.